Somewhere beneath the soft weight of evening there is a workshop. It sits at the edge of an industrial town, its walls dark with soot, its windows yellowed by years of smoke and winter fog. The year is somewhere in the long middle of the 19th century, and the world outside is changing faster than most people can follow. Railways pushing through countryside, cities swelling at their edges, factories rising where fields once stood, and in the gaps between all of that noise and speed, ordinary people going quietly to work. They are not soldiers or monarchs. They do not appear in history books by choice. They are match girls, young women and girls, some barely past childhood, who walk through iron gates every morning before the sun has fully risen and take their places at long, wooden benches in rooms thick with chemical dust. They are not heroes in the way that word is usually used. They are simply people who needed work and found it in the one place that would have them. And what happened to them inside those walls is a story that the industry that employed them spent a great deal of effort ensuring would never be told. But the light, as it always does, eventually found its way out. Settle into wherever you are resting now. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders, your hands, your jaw. There is nowhere else to be, only here and the soft amber glow of a story that begins with something as small and ordinary as a single struck match. And it ends somewhere you will not expect. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before there were matches, there was fire, and before fire was simple, it was a daily negotiation. For most of human history, starting a fire required patience that the modern world finds almost unimaginable. You needed dry tinder, a flint, a steel, the right angle of strike, the right breath of air, and a willingness to begin again if the first attempt failed. In cold weather, the process took longer. In wet weather, it could seem almost impossible. Fire was valuable precisely because it was not easy. You kept your hearth burning overnight not out of comfort alone, but out of practicality, because letting it die meant starting the whole laborious process again in the morning. The idea that fire could be portable, that you could carry the means of ignition in a small box in your pocket and produce a flame in a single stroke, was not merely convenient, it was revolutionary. It changed the way people cooked, the way they lit their homes, the way they smoked their tobacco, the way they managed the 1,000 small tasks of daily life that required a reliable source of light. The friction match, once it arrived in the early decades of the 19th century, quickly became one of those inventions so woven into ordinary life that people could barely remember existing without it. But like most things that become ordinary, the story of how it was made was anything but. The match industry grew rapidly in the second half of the 19th century, spreading across Britain, across Europe, across North America, establishing factories in industrial towns where labour was cheap and regulations were few. The matches these factories produced were small, unremarkable objects: a thin stick of pine or aspen, a head of chemical compound, a strip of roughened surface to strike against. They were sold by the box, bought by the household, used without a second thought and discarded without ceremony. No one who struck a match against their kitchen mantelpiece and touched it to a candle thought much about where it came from. No one wondered about the hands that made it, or the rooms those hands spent their days in, or what the air in those rooms felt like after months or years of continuous breathing. The factory owners understood this perfectly. As long as matches arrived in their boxes, small and functional and affordable, no one would ask questions. And for a very long time, no one did. The process of making a match was not complicated, but it was relentless. Raw wood arrived in large quantities and was cut into thin strips called splints. These splints were then fed through machines or, in many factories, handled largely by hand at every stage, cut, sorted, dipped, sorted again, packed. The work required attention but not skill in the way that a craftsman's work required skill. It was repetitive, exacting, unceasing, and designed to produce the maximum number of finished matches for the minimum possible cost. The chemical at the heart of the match was white phosphorus. It was chosen for practical reasons. White phosphorus was reliable. It could be manufactured in consistent quantities. It produced a predictable flame when struck, and it was cheap. It was also, as the industry had understood from relatively early in its expansion, profoundly dangerous. Not in the way that fire itself was dangerous, obvious, immediate, understood, but dangerous in a slower, quieter way, a way that unfolded over months and years rather than moments, a way that could be denied and minimized and explained away as something else entirely by anyone with sufficient incentive to do so. The workers in these factories, the vast majority of them women and girls, encountered white phosphorus every single day. It settled into the air they breathed. It coated the surfaces they touched. It drifted through the rooms where they sat for 12 hours and more, dipping and sorting and packing by the thousands. And in the darkness outside those factories, in the hours after work, something strange sometimes happened. They glowed. Not dramatically, not like a lantern or a torch, but a faint cold luminescence, visible in a dark room or a dark alley, emanating from their jaws, from their faces, from the places where the phosphorus had made its way beneath the surface of their skin. Some of them noticed it themselves. Others were told by family members who saw them come home in the evening and watched, disturbed and uncertain, as their daughter or their sister or their wife moved through the darkened house with a ghostly pallor that had nothing to do with moonlight. It had a name, this luminescence. The workers called it phossy jaw. But by the time the glow appeared, the worst had already begun. And there was something else, something beneath the glow, something the medical reports did not record, something passed in whispers between the women at the benches in the brief moments when the overlookers were not watching. Some of the girls had begun to notice things in the dark. Not the glow itself. They knew the glow. They had learned to live with it the way you learn to live with any constant and unwelcome companion, by acknowledging it silently and moving on. This was something different. This was the sense, in the deepest hours of the night, that the darkness around them was not entirely empty, that the cold light coming from their own faces was being answered, faintly and from a great distance, by something that had no name and no factory record and no official explanation. They did not speak of it outside the factory walls, they barely spoke of it within them. But it was there, and the story of what it was, that is where this night is going. The factories did not advertise their working conditions, they did not need to. In the industrial towns of Britain in the mid to late 19th century, work was not something you selected according to preference. It was something you found where you could find it, and you were grateful to find it at all. The women and girls who worked in match factories did not arrive there because they had weighed their options, and determined that white phosphorus dipping was a promising career path. They arrived because they needed to eat, because their families needed rent money, because there were younger siblings at home or a mother who could not work or a father who had died or left, and because the match factory paid a wage and asked no particular questions about your age or your history. The workforce was almost entirely female, not by accident. Factory owners in this period had discovered something that they would never have stated plainly, but that is obvious enough in retrospect. Women could be paid less, particularly young women, particularly women with few other options. The match factories of London and Sheffield and Glasgow and Stockholm and New York were staffed primarily by girls and young women from the working classes, some as young as 12 or 13, working days that began before dawn and ended long after the light had gone. Their wages were low, not merely in comparison to men doing similar work, though that was also true, but low in an absolute sense, barely sufficient to cover the most basic necessities of life in a crowded industrial city. And those wages were further reduced by a system of fines that the factory management enforced with ruthless creativity. You could be fined for arriving late. You could be fined for being absent, even when the absence was caused by illness. You could be fined for having matches on your bench. You could be fined for talking, for sitting in the wrong place, for any number of infractions that the management defined and enforced at will. This system of fines was not unique to the match industry, but in the match industry it carried an additional cruelty, because the girls being fined were already being slowly poisoned by the work they were being fined for performing inadequately. The factory rooms themselves were not described kindly by the few outsiders who occasionally glimpsed them. Long and low, they were lit by windows that provided insufficient ventilation, even when open, and in cold weather were kept closed. The air was thick with the dust of phosphorus compounds, with the smell of burning and chemicals, with the accumulated exhalations of dozens of workers in a space not designed with their comfort in mind. The benches were long and plain. The light was yellow and insufficient, the work never stopped. There was a hierarchy of sorts within the factory. The older girls and women, those who had survived several years in the work, occupied positions slightly removed from the most concentrated chemical exposure. The newer workers, the youngest girls, took the places at the dipping vats and the drying rooms where the phosphorus was most present and most dangerous. This was not a policy. It was simply how things organised themselves. Those with seniority moved themselves incrementally away from the most toxic positions, and those who were new filled the gaps left behind, breathing the air that the more experienced workers had learned to avoid. Most of the girls did not know what white phosphorus was. They knew it made the matches light. They knew it left a smell on their clothes and a taste in their mouths. They knew that some of the girls in the factory had jaw trouble, though the connection between that trouble and the work was not something anyone in a position of authority was inclined to confirm. They were told the jaw trouble was personal, a result of prior dental problems, of general poor health, of conditions that had nothing to do with the factory. This explanation required a certain sustained willingness to disbelieve evidence that was visible to anyone who looked carefully. But the factories of the 19th century were not places where careful looking was encouraged. And yet some of them looked anyway. There was a girl, and this is where the story begins to turn in a direction the official records do not follow, who had been at the Bryant and May factory on Fairfield Road for nearly 4 years by the spring of 1887. Her name, as it appears in one faded Union record and a single journalist's notebook from the period, was Eliza Dowd. She was 19 years old. She had started at the factory at 15, which was not unusual. She worked the dipping bench, which was the worst position, the one with the heaviest phosphorus exposure, and she had held it for most of those 4 years because she was quick and reliable, and the overlooker preferred girls who did not complain to girls who did not get things done. Eliza Dowd had already begun to show the early signs of phosphorus accumulation. Her jaw ached in the cold. In very dark rooms, her face gave off the faint luminescence that the girls at the factory had long since learned to recognise and not comment on. She knew what was coming. She had watched it happen to others. She understood the progression with the quiet, intimate knowledge of someone who lives in proximity to a thing and cannot afford the luxury of not understanding it. But Eliza Dowd had noticed something else. She had noticed that the glow was not only hers. The name is almost gentle, phossy jaw. It sounds like something minor, something manageable, a condition you might complain about over a cup of tea and recover from by the weekend. It was not minor, it was not manageable, and it did not resolve itself over the weekend. Phossy jaw, its medical name was phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, was a consequence of chronic exposure to white phosphorus vapour. In the factory rooms, this vapour was not hypothetical. It was present every day, in every breath, accumulating in the bodies of the workers over months and years, finding its way through pores and lungs and eventually into the bone tissue of the jaw. Once there, it began to destroy. The process started quietly enough. A toothache, perhaps, a swelling in the gum, something that any reasonable person, and certainly any factory owner seeking to minimise inconvenience, could explain as ordinary dental trouble. In an era before widely accessible dental care, toothaches were common, gum swelling was common. The girls were not unusual in having such complaints, and the factories were not unusual in declining to investigate whether there might be a specific cause. But the swelling did not resolve, it grew. The tissue around the jaw began to change, to thicken and harden in places and become soft and corrupted in others. The bone beneath, the jaw itself, began to die from within, a process that doctors of the era described with clinical precision, noting that the bone took on a greenish tint in the worst cases, that it glowed in the dark with the same cold phosphorescent light that had been observed on the skin of the workers themselves. The pain was described by those who experienced it as continuous and severe. Not a pain that came and went, not a pain that could be temporarily managed and then put aside, but a constant deep ache that worsened with pressure, with movement, with a simple act of eating or speaking. Sleep for those in the later stages became difficult or impossible. The disease progressed, the jaw swelled further, the face changed shape. The affected bone began to die in larger sections, becoming necrotic and creating abscesses that wept and did not close. The smell of these infections was noted by contemporary observers as being distinctive, a chemical sweetness underneath the odour of corruption, the phosphorus announcing its presence even in the destruction it was causing. In the worst cases, the jaw required removal. A girl might survive the extraction of the diseased tissue and the damaged bone, might recover physically after a fashion, might live for many years afterward, but she would be disfigured for the rest of her life. Some did not survive. All of this is documented. All of this is in the medical literature and the factory inspection reports, and the testimony gathered by journalists and reformers in the late decades of the 19th century. But there is another set of records, not medical records, not factory logs, not parliamentary minutes. These are the records that were never meant to be official, never meant to survive, and yet did, in the way that things written in the margins of notebooks and the backs of letters sometimes outlast the more deliberate documents they accompanied. They are the private notes of a physician named Dr. Edmund Farrow, who worked in Bow in the 1880s, and who treated a number of the women from the Bryant and May factory, and who wrote, in a private notebook that passed eventually to his granddaughter, and then to a small archive at a local history society, something that the official record of phosphorus necrosis does not include. He wrote that some of the women who came to him with advanced cases of the disease described perceptions that he had initially attributed to fever, to the delirium that can accompany severe infection, to the psychological strain of long suffering. Women who told him they saw light in places where no light existed, who described voices that seemed to come from the walls of rooms, or from the ground beneath them, or from other people who were not speaking, who said they could tell simply by looking at another person's face in darkness whether that person was also carrying the phosphorus, whether the faint glow was present or absent, in a way that went beyond the visible luminescence that anyone could observe. Dr. Farrow attributed this to the chemical's effect on the nervous system, which was not an unreasonable hypothesis. Phosphorus compounds are known to affect neurological function. The brain of a person with severe phosphorus toxicity is not functioning under ordinary conditions. But there was one account in his notebook that he could not file cleanly under neurological damage, and it is this account that connects to what Eliza Dowd had noticed, and to the direction in which this story is about to move. There were match factories in many places, but the one that history remembers most clearly sat in Bow, in the East End of London, on a road called Fairfield Road, and it was called Bryant and May. By the late 1880s, Bryant and May was one of the largest match manufacturers in Britain, a firm that had grown from modest origins into a significant commercial enterprise, exporting matches across the empire and beyond, paying dividends to its shareholders with reassuring consistency, and presenting itself to the public as a reputable firm conducting legitimate business in an important industry. The women and girls at Bryant and May worked long days for wages reduced by the system of fines already described. They worked in rooms saturated with white phosphorus vapour. They ate their meals in those same rooms because there was no separate space designated for the purpose, which meant that every bite of food consumed during the working day was consumed in an atmosphere of phosphorus contamination. All of this is the known history. But within the known history there is a geography, and the geography of the Bryant and May factory on Fairfield Road contains a room that does not appear prominently in the accounts left by journalists and reformers and factory inspectors. It appears in one floor plan from an 1879 survey of the premises, labelled simply as Storage Room C, situated at the northern end of the main production building, below grade by approximately 4 feet, a subfloor room accessible by a short flight of wooden stairs, used ostensibly for the storage of surplus chemical stock. The women who worked in the main production rooms knew about Storage Room C, not because they worked in it. They did not. No worker was regularly assigned there, but because of what came out of it. The smell, for one thing. The phosphorus smell that permeated the entire factory had a different character near the northern end of the building, nearer to the stairs that led down to Storage Room C. Sharper. Older somehow, as though the compound in that space had been there longer, had soaked into the stone walls and the earth floor with a thoroughness that the newer batches in the main production rooms had not yet achieved. And the light. On winter evenings, when the main production rooms were dim and the overlookers had reduced the gas lamps to save fuel as the late shift wound down, the women at the benches closest to the northern wall sometimes noticed a faint illumination beneath the gap at the bottom of the door that led to the Storage Room C stairs. Not steady light, fluctuating. The cold blue-green of phosphorescence, but brighter than anything a stored batch of chemical compound should have been producing, and occasionally moving in a way that chemical compounds being inanimate generally did not. Most of the women filed this away in the category of things that the factory produced that were not worth investigating. The factory produced a great many things that were not worth investigating, in the sense that investigating them was unlikely to produce useful information and reasonably likely to produce a fine or a dismissal. But Eliza Dowd had been at the Northern Bench for 4 years. She had seen the light beneath that door perhaps hundreds of times, and in the last months before the strike of 1888, she had begun to pay attention to the pattern. The light appeared most reliably on nights when the weather was changing, when a storm was coming, or when the temperature was dropping sharply, or when something in the atmospheric pressure was shifting in a way she could not have explained but could feel in the persistent ache of her jaw. It appeared, she had noted with the quiet, systematic attention of someone who has little else to do during long hours of repetitive work, always in the 2 or 3 hours after midnight during the night shifts, and only then. And it appeared she had noticed most strongly on the nights when the girls who were furthest along in their illness, the ones with the most visible glow, the ones whose jaws had swollen most noticeably, the ones who were furthest into the progression of the disease, seemed most agitated, most wakeful, most likely to be found staring at the northern wall with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but something in between. Eliza had asked one of them about it, only once. A woman named Catherine, 10 years older than Eliza, who had been at the factory longer than anyone else on the main floor, and whose jaw, by that point, gave off enough luminescence that she was careful never to enter a fully dark room in the presence of anyone who did not already know about it. Eliza had asked what Catherine was looking at on one of those midnight nights while the northern wall pulsed with its faint irregular light. Catherine had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said in a voice pitched low enough that the overlooker could not hear, "It is looking back." It was the 3rd week of July, 1888, and roughly 1,400 women and girls stood outside the gates of Bryant and May on Fairfield Road, instead of behind them. They had not planned it with the precision of an organised campaign. The walkout happened quickly, the way many acts of collective courage happen, not because someone calculated the odds and decided they were favourable, but because a threshold was crossed, and when it was crossed, enough people crossed it together that the momentum became its own force. The women who came out of that factory gate and stood in the street were not people with much to lose in the conventional accounting of such things. They had little money, they had limited social influence, they were working-class women in a city and an era that regarded working-class women as the most expendable category of human being. What the company had not fully considered was that 1,400 women standing together in a street are a different thing than 1,400 women sitting separately at benches. The strike made the newspapers. Annie Besant wrote about it. The image of young women and girls, some of them visibly unwell, some of them carrying the early signs of the jaw disease, standing together outside the gates attracted attention that the company found deeply inconvenient. The women organised. They identified their demands with a clarity that suggests they had thought about these things for a long time without having had the occasion to say them aloud. End the fines, a separate dining room, restoration of the cut wages, the dismissal reviewed. And among the demands, buried in the 3rd or 4th item on the list, noted in the Union Committee's own handwritten minutes with a brevity that suggests it was considered simultaneously important and dangerous to state too plainly, was this: access to Storage Room C to be denied to factory management during the period of the strike action. Not requested, denied. The women in striking were asserting that the management of Bryant and May should not be permitted to enter that room. This demand does not appear in the published accounts of the strike. It does not appear in Besant's pamphlets or newspaper columns. It was not one of the items that was ultimately negotiated or conceded. The management of Bryant and May, as far as the surviving official record shows, never acknowledged that this demand had been made. But it is in the minutes, written in a careful hand in pencil, on a page that was folded and tucked inside the back cover of the committee notebook, as though whoever put it there had wanted it preserved but not prominently placed. When the strike ended, when Bryant and May agreed to the terms on the table, and the women returned to the factory, Storage Room C was sealed, not by the women, by the company. A new lock was fitted. The stairs were boarded over. A notice was posted indicating that the room was condemned due to structural concerns with the subfloor. The structural survey that would have supported this explanation was never filed with the local authority. The room was sealed, and it stayed sealed, and in the weeks after the women returned to work, the light that had flickered under the door at the northern end of the production floor was not seen again. Catherine, the older woman who had told Eliza that it was looking back, Catherine did not return to the factory after the strike. She had given testimony to one of the labour organisers during the walkout weeks. She had been among the most visibly affected by the disease. After the settlement was reached and the women went back through the gate on Fairfield Road, Catherine was not among them. No record of what happened to her afterward has been found. She does not appear in subsequent census records. She does not appear in the records of the infirmaries that served the East End. She simply stops appearing, which is a thing that sometimes happened to women in her situation, and which history, as noted, has not always troubled itself to explain. Eliza Dowd returned to work. She said nothing about the sealed room. She worked for another 8 months, until the progression of her own condition made it impossible to continue. She left the factory in March of 1889. She received no compensation. What she did in the years after leaving the factory, that is the part of the story that the official record characteristically did not preserve. But someone did. There is a life that exists around a factory, pressed against its walls and filling the spaces between the shifts, and it is not the life that the factory acknowledges. The East End of London in the 1880s was a world of narrow streets and close-packed buildings, of the smell of the river and the smell of cooking and the smell of industries that had no particular incentive to manage what they released into the air around them. It was dense with life, with families occupying rooms in houses that had once been single residences and had been subdivided over the decades by landlords for whom square footage was currency. The women and girls who worked at the match factory lived in this world. They walked to work in the dark of early morning and walked home in the dark of evening. In winter, they rarely saw daylight except through factory windows. Their home lives were not documented with the thoroughness that history reserves for the comfortable. What survives is fragmentary. But among the fragments there is a collection of letters, 31 letters in total, held now in a private collection and examined by only a handful of researchers, written between 1889 and 1902 by Eliza Dowd to a woman named Mrs. Frances Hartley, who had been a neighbour on the street where Eliza lived before she was forced to leave her lodgings due to inability to pay rent following her departure from the factory. The letters are written in a clear, careful hand that suggests Eliza had some education or had taught herself to write with more precision than her circumstances would have been expected to produce. The early letters are practical. She writes from a new address in Whitechapel, mentions finding some piecework sewing, asks after mutual acquaintances. They read as the letters of a young woman making her careful way through reduced circumstances with as much dignity as she can maintain. By the fourth letter, something has shifted. She writes about the nights, not about the nights in the way someone complaining of insomnia would write, not with frustration or exhaustion, but with a quality that is harder to categorize. She writes that the darkness of her room is different from the darkness she remembers from before the factory. She writes that she can feel the cold light from her own jaw as a kind of warmth, which she understands is a contradiction, but which she cannot describe otherwise. She writes that in the deepest hours of the night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, she sometimes senses that the darkness around her is not uniform, that there are thickenings in it, places where the air feels denser and where the cold from her jaw seems to intensify, as though it is being drawn towards something. She does not call this frightening, she calls it interesting. By the 7th letter, she is doing something deliberate with it. She has begun, she writes to Frances Hartley, sitting up in those deep night hours with a candle extinguished and her eyes fully adjusted to the darkness, remaining still and paying attention to where the thickenings are. She has begun to notice that they are not random. They appear in particular corners, near particular surfaces, and they appear more reliably on certain nights, which she has correlated with the methodical patience that characterized her observations in the factory, with changes in the weather, with phases of the moon, with something she cannot yet name but is working toward naming. She has also begun, she writes, to visit other women. Former factory workers, women who had developed the same condition she had, women who are still carrying the phosphorus in their bones, still glowing faintly in the dark, still living with the slow deterioration that the factory had begun in them. She does not say in the 7th letter what happens when she visits these women. She says only that she has found something worth testing and that the results have been consistent. In the 8th letter she says more. She writes, "The light in us is not only ours." The disease had a medical history longer than its public one. Physicians who worked in industrial cities in the mid-19th century had begun to see cases of jaw necrosis that did not fit the expected profile of ordinary dental infection. By the time the British match industry was at its height, the scientific literature contained enough accumulated observation to remove any serious doubt about the cause. White phosphorus, inhaled in sufficient quantities over sufficient time, destroyed the jaw. This was not a difficult conclusion to reach. The difficulty was in getting people with the power to act on it to care enough to do so. Dr. Edmund Farrow worked in Bow in the 1880s and treated a number of the women from the Bryant and May factory. His private notebook, passed eventually to his granddaughter and then to a small local history archive, contains the clinical observations already mentioned. The women who describe perceptions that he attributed to neurological damage, the sense of light where no light existed, the voices from walls and floors, the ability to perceive the phosphorus in others beyond the visible glow. But the notebook contains more than clinical observations. In the last 40 pages, written from the change in handwriting during a period of evident agitation, the letters pressed harder into the paper and the margins filled with notes that circle back to cross-reference earlier entries. Dr. Farrow records a series of visits he made to a number of his former patients in the years 1889 and 1890, prompted by a letter he had received from one of them. The letter was from Eliza Dowd. He does not reproduce the letter in full. He summarizes it, noting that she had written to him because she trusted him. He had, his notes indicate, been one of the few physicians who had been honest with his patients about the cause of their condition, who had not told them it was prior dental problems or poor constitution, and that she'd described to him, with a precision he found difficult to dismiss, a set of observations about the behaviour of phosphorescent tissue at night that did not accord with anything in the standard medical literature. He visited her. He writes that he found her in a small room in Whitechapel, living with evident frugality, her jaw visibly affected, her manner composed and precise. She showed him, that first evening, what she'd been observing. He sat with her in the darkened room, a physician in his 40s, trained in the empirical traditions of Victorian medicine, a man who had spent his career reducing human suffering to its chemical and mechanical components, and watched as Eliza Dowd demonstrated that in the complete darkness of her room, the cold light from her jaw moved. Not the jaw, the light. It extended. In the darkness, with the candle out and the curtains drawn and no external source of illumination, the faint phosphorescent glow that emanated from the affected bone tissue of her jaw did not remain fixed at the boundary of her skin. It drifted, slowly, the way smoke drifts in still air. It pooled in certain corners of the room. It concentrated near certain surfaces, near the floor particularly, and near the wall that backed onto the street outside. Farrow writes that he had no explanation for this. He visited again the following week, and this time he brought instruments. He measured light intensity with the equipment available to him, which was limited. He noted what he could. He writes that the drift of the phosphorescent emanation was not consistent from night to night, but was consistent in its relationship to certain conditions: temperature, atmospheric pressure, and one variable that he spends 3 pages trying to describe accurately before settling on a phrase he clearly finds unsatisfying: the presence of attention. By which he means the light behaved differently when it was being observed. Not in the way that subatomic particles behave differently when observed, which was not yet a concept available to Victorian medicine. He means something more immediate and more unsettling. When Eliza Dowd was passively present in the room, but not specifically attending to the light, it drifted in its usual patterns. When she directed her attention toward it, when she focused, in whatever way she had taught herself to focus, the drift intensified, the pooling in the corners deepened, the concentration near the floor increased, and on 3 occasions, which he documents with the careful hedging of a man who understands that what he is writing will be regarded with suspicion by his colleagues, the light appeared to move in a way that was directional. Towards something. He could not identify what. The corners and the floor and the walls revealed in his examination by subsequent daylight nothing unusual. The building was an ordinary Whitechapel tenement. The walls were plaster over brick. The floor was wood over joists over the earth of the foundations. But on the third occasion, Eliza Dowd told him what the light was pointing at. She said it was pointing at the place where someone had been. The match girls returned to work in the summer of 1888 with their limited victories secured and their fundamental situation unchanged. The factory kept operating. The white phosphorus kept being used. The chemical kept settling into the air and onto the benches and into the lungs and jawbones of the workers. In the world outside the factory, the labour movement grew stronger. The match girls' strike had demonstrated something important, which was that workers who had been assumed to have no power could exercise collective power effectively. But in a set of rooms in Whitechapel and Bow and Bethnal Green, something else was also developing, quieter, stranger, and entirely outside the frameworks that the labour movement or the medical establishment or the factory owners or the parliamentary reformers had for understanding what was happening in the industrial city around them. Eliza Dowd had begun to teach. This is documented in the letters to Frances Hartley, which become more detailed and more assured as the correspondence progresses through 1889 and 1890. It is also documented more fragmentarily in Dr. Farrow's notebook, which records several visits to rooms where he found Eliza in the company of other women, always former factory workers, always women who had carried the phosphorus long enough to develop the condition, sitting in darkness and doing something that he struggles to describe accurately. They were not praying. He is specific about this, perhaps because prayer would have been the easiest available category, and he is aware of that. They were not in trance in the theatrical sense of spiritualist seances, which were fashionable in this period, and which Farrow regards with the contempt of a man who has spent too much time with actual suffering to have patience for performance. They were attending, that is the word he returns to. They were sitting in darkness, with the cold light pooling around them in the way it had pooled around Eliza alone, and they were attending, directing their awareness, with a discipline that he describes as remarkable in women who had received no formal training in anything resembling meditative practice, toward the thickenings in the darkness that Eliza had first described in her letter. What they were doing with those thickenings is where the notebook becomes most careful and most strange. Farrow writes that on his fourth visit to one of these gatherings, 7 women, in a room in Bethnal Green, the glow from their accumulated phosphorescent tissue providing the only illumination, faint and fluctuating but sufficient to make the room navigable, he witnessed something that he subsequently spent 6 pages of his notebook attempting to explain through chemical and neurological mechanisms before conceding, in small handwriting, that crowds the bottom margin of the final page that he did not have an explanation. The darkness in the room had moved. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical manner of a stage illusion, but the quality of the darkness in the far corner of the room, behind a chest of drawers, in the space between the wall and a piece of furniture that had not been moved in years, judging by the dust on the floor around it, had changed. It had thinned. The way darkness thins before dawn, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you realize not that light has arrived, but that it has been arriving for some time, and you simply did not notice. In the thinned darkness behind the chest of drawers, Farrow writes, there was a shape. Not a phosphorescent shape, not cold blue-green, something warmer, something that occupied the space with the specific quality of something that had always been there and was simply now, for reasons that the women sitting in the room apparently understood and that Farrow did not, willing to be seen. He describes the shape for half a page and then crosses out everything he wrote and begins again. The second attempt is briefer. He writes, it had the shape of a person who was no longer present in the way that living persons are present. It had, he writes, pressing the pen hard enough into the paper that the letters are slightly embossed on the reverse side, the specific quality of a person who had been in a room for a very long time without being noticed. The women in the room did not react with fear. They reacted with recognition. And Eliza Dowd, from across the room, said a name. The name was Catherine. History has a tendency to remember the moments rather than the people inside them. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 is in the history books. It is taught in schools. It is referenced in discussions of labour history and women's history, and the specific history of the East End of London. But the individual women, the specific girls who stood at specific benches and developed specific symptoms and went home to specific rooms, most of them are known to history only fragmentarily, if at all. Catherine, who had worked the benches at Bryant and May longer than anyone else on the main floor, who had told Eliza that the light in storage room C was looking back, who had not returned to work after the strike of 1888, Catherine left no clear subsequent record, no census entry, no infirmary record, no death certificate that has been found in the available archives. She had simply, in the language of official record-keeping, stopped appearing. But in Dr. Farrow's notebook her name appears many times in the final 40 pages, not as a patient, not as a subject of medical observation, as something more difficult to categorise, written with a reluctance that is evident in the way the entries circle around her name before finally committing to it as a presence. Farrow writes about returning to the room in Bethnal Green multiple times over the following weeks. The gatherings continued. The women who attended them changed slightly from visit to visit. Some came once and did not return, some came every time, but the core group remained consistent, and Eliza remained at its centre. And in the corner behind the chest of drawers, in the thinned darkness that the phosphorescent light of 7 sick women had somehow learned to manage, the presence that Farrow had first observed on that 4th visit continued to be accessible. He writes, and here his clinical caution is almost entirely abandoned, replaced by something that reads more like awe than fear, that the presence communicated, not in words at first, in what he can only describe as atmospheric adjustment. The feeling in the room changed when particular subjects were introduced. Warmth increased or decreased. The phosphorescent glow of the women brightened or dimmed. Once, a small object on the chest of drawers, a ceramic dish used for holding pins, moved. Not violently. A few inches to the left in a single smooth motion, while 7 women watched and a Victorian physician watched and wrote about it in the notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Over subsequent visits, the communication became more specific. The women had developed, through the practice of attendance that Eliza had been refining for 2 years, a kind of dialogue, not verbal, nothing so simple, but a dialogue of light and pressure and the specific quality of the cold blue-green glow that the phosphorus had left in their bones. The presence in the corner, Farrow eventually concluded, was responding to the phosphorescent emanation of the women, the way those emanations responded to each other. The chemical that had made the factory workers glow in the dark, that had destroyed their bone tissue, that had disfigured their faces and shortened their lives. That chemical was also, it appeared, the medium of the conversation. The phosphorus was a frequency, and something that had been present in the factory for a very long time. Present in the walls and the floor and the deeply soaked stone of the subfloor room, storage room C, where the chemical had been accumulating for decades before Bryant and May even came to occupy the building, had learned to use that frequency. Had been using it, perhaps, for far longer than the match industry had been in operation. Farrow writes, in the last substantial entry of the notebook, that he asked the women what they believed the presence to be. He expected, he admits, a spiritualist answer, a spirit, a ghost, the residue of someone dead. He was prepared to file this under the category of sincere but unfounded belief, and returned to his attempt to explain the observations through available chemistry. Eliza Dowd's answer surprised him. She said it was not the residue of a person. It was something older than the factory, older than the street, older than the city, something that had been in the earth beneath that particular spot for long enough that the concept of human time was not entirely adequate to describe the duration. It was not hostile, it was not benevolent in any simple sense. It was present, and it had been trying, for as long as the factory had been there saturating its environment with phosphorescent compounds, to make itself legible to the humans who were inadvertently providing it with a medium it could work with. She said it had been trying to communicate something specific. She said it had been trying to communicate this for the entire duration of the match factory's operation. And she said that what it was trying to communicate was a warning. Not about the phosphorus. The warning about the phosphorus was, by 1890, already in the process of being acted on. The disease was documented, the reformers were pressing, the legislation would eventually come. The warning was about something beneath storage room C, something that the phosphorus had been slowly, accidentally, over the course of decades of industrial production, beginning to dissolve. Consider for a moment what a struck match actually is. It is the oldest human act, the making of fire, reduced to something you can hold between two fingers and ignite with a single motion against a strip of rough surface. It is the accumulated knowledge of chemistry and manufacturing and material science, the result of decades of industrial development, available for the price of a box in any corner shop. It is ordinary, unremarkable, available, disposable. And it was made by hands that glowed in the dark. The phosphorus ban of 1910 removed the white phosphorus from British matches and replaced it with the red phosphorus compounds that had been available and viable since the 1840s. The workers in match factories after 1910 did not develop jaw necrosis. The specific horror of phossy jaw was over. The match factory at Bow, Bryant and May, the building on Fairfield Road, continued to operate under various forms of ownership until it finally closed in 1979. The building was subsequently converted to residential use, as previously noted. It is now apartments. The exposed brick is considered charming. The high windows that once provided insufficient ventilation to rooms full of phosphorus vapour now admit attractive quantities of natural light into open-plan living spaces. Storage Room C was sealed in 1888, following the strike, and it remained sealed through every subsequent renovation, change of ownership, and eventually the residential conversion. The builders who carried out the conversion in the early 1980s noted in a site report an anomaly in the subfloor of the northern section of the building, a space of approximately 40 square feet that could not be fully mapped because the survey equipment produced inconsistent readings when directed into it. The report attributed this to residual chemical contamination affecting the instruments. The space was sealed with a concrete pour and the conversion proceeded. The inconsistent readings were not residual chemical contamination affecting the instruments, but the builders did not know this, and in any case the end result, the space remaining sealed, the concrete poured, the residential apartments proceeding without incident, was arguably the correct outcome. Arguably. Dr. Edmund Farrow died in 1901. His notebook passed to his daughter, who passed it to her daughter, who was a schoolteacher in Kent with no particular interest in industrial history, and who kept it in a box under a bed for 30 years before donating it to a local history society during a clearing of house. The society catalogued it as a medical notebook, mid-Victorian, and filed it without reading it thoroughly, which is how archives frequently work. A researcher named Patricia Lowe, working on a history of East End labour conditions in the 1990s, read it thoroughly. She published a paper on the medical observations it contained, the clinical documentation of phosphorus necrosis, the patient testimony about neurological effects, and noted in a footnote that the final 40 pages were of a different character and would require separate consideration. She has not, as of the time this story was researched, published that separate consideration. She's still alive. She does not answer emails about the notebook. Eliza Dowd's letters to Frances Hartley end in 1902. The final letter is brief. She writes that she is leaving London. She gives no destination. She says that she has finished the work she needed to do, and that she is grateful for the correspondence and the friendship it represents. She says that the light in her jaw has dimmed considerably over the previous year, and she is uncertain whether this is the progression of the disease or something else. She says something else in the last paragraph of the last letter that Frances Hartley, who kept these letters until her own death and whose family preserved them afterward, apparently never told anyone about, because the last paragraph has a strip of paper pasted over it, carefully, neatly, with glue that has since dried to a deep amber, covering whatever was written underneath. Someone at some point decided that the last thing Eliza Dowd wrote to her friend was not for general reading. Whether it was Frances Hartley herself, or a family member acting on her instructions, or someone else entirely, that is not known. The strip of paper is still there. It has not been removed. The archive that now holds the letters has been contacted by at least 2 researchers who asked permission to lift it, and on both occasions the archive declined, citing conservation concerns. Conservation concerns. The letters are otherwise well preserved. The paper is fragile in the way that paper from that period is fragile but stable. The conservation concern that applies specifically to the strip pasted over the final paragraph is not further elaborated in the archive's correspondence. What Eliza Dowd wrote at the end of her last letter to Frances Hartley is not known. What the presence beneath Storage Room C was trying to warn about is not known. What was happening in the deep night hours in a Whitechapel room where 7 women who glowed in the dark sat together in the dark and did something that a Victorian physician could not explain, what that was, in its full extent, is not known. What is known is this. The matchgirls of Bryant and May made fire for the comfortable homes of Victorian England. They made it at the cost of their bodies, and in some cases their lives. They made it in rooms thick with a chemical that glowed cold and blue-green in the darkness, and that had been, for reasons nobody in a position of authority was interested in examining, accumulating in a sealed subfloor room in a North London factory, for longer than the factory itself had been in operation. The chemical found them, or they found it, or something that the chemical was resonant with found them through it, the way a bell finds a particular frequency and answers it. They glowed, and eventually in the slow way that history allows they were seen. But not entirely, not fully. The last paragraph is still pasted over, the subfloor space is still sealed under concrete. The archive does not answer certain emails. And somewhere in the deep hours of the night, in the small gap between 2 and 4 in the morning when the darkness has its own quality, and the house is at its quietest, the cold light, if you are carrying it, if something in your own depths has been accumulating long enough to produce even the faintest resonance, the cold light does not stay where it belongs. It drifts. It pulls in the corners. And if you're still enough, and quiet enough, and paying attention in the particular way that Eliza Dowd spent 2 years teaching herself to pay attention, you might notice that the darkness in certain corners is not entirely uniform. That there are thickenings in it. That the thickenings are not random. And that they are, slowly, patiently, with the unhurried persistence of something that has been waiting long enough that a few more years of waiting is no particular inconvenience, moving toward the light. Let your breathing slow. The benches are empty, the gates are closed, the long work of the day is over. The darkness around you is ordinary darkness. The quiet of this room is ordinary quiet. The weight settling into your limbs as sleep approaches is the ordinary weight of rest, of the body releasing what it has been holding through the long hours since morning. You are safe. The matches have all been struck. The light is just enough. And the thickenings in the corners, if you notice them at all, are simply the way darkness pools in the deep hours, simply the ordinary architecture of a room at rest, simply the comfortable and familiar geography of a night that has nothing to offer you but sleep. Simply that. Close your eyes. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Did the twist change how you felt about the story? And do you think some historical mysteries are better left unexplained? Let us know in the comments below.